Fantastic, and if we had some drums in as well. Hi guys, I'm SKETI, welcome back to another tutorial. Today we're going to look how to make Reese basses in ABLETON Live using operator, saturator, glue compressor, EQ8, all those kind of things that we've used before in previous tutorials. Reese basses are popular in music like jungle, drum and bass, breaks, house music, anything that's got a bit of a baroque beat. Really popular with old school kind of dance genres, back to your rave scene in the 90s, and start creating an extra Reese out of it. And then this is what that has now become. So let's get to it. I've set up a MIDI channel like I usually do. I've put in a MIDI region with a note with F1. In this kind of music I tend to write in the key of F, because when you listen to this kind of music in clubs or festivals or even on smaller speakers, that sub-frequency really hits hard, and it's a great key to work in. Now, I'm not saying you have to work in F, but it's a popular key to work in just because of that. If we look at the music tech side, production side of it and mixing, the F note really hits hard in the sub. So, set up an operator, haven't added anything to it yet. I'm just going to drop the fundamental to 0.5, so when that sub plays, if I just turn on the record down for it, you might not be able to hear that now if you're on a small speaker. It's at the appropriate sub level. Now the next thing, we're going to keep the routing in series instead of parallel, because I want this, I'm only going to use two oscillators, the second oscillator to frequency modulate oscillator A. So first thing I'm going to do is turn the pitch envelope on. Just now, this isn't necessary for this, I just want to have that sort of spike in. If we listen, yep, so just turn that back to about 35 milliseconds. Just so it starts at 12 semitones above the fundamental and drops down. Now you don't have to do that, I just personally like to. Now the next thing is, if we start turning this other oscillator up, at the moment it's not going to really sound like a Reese. Let's listen. But using this fine tune dial, which works in sense, is going to allow that frequency modulation to start phasing against it, the next oscillator. And if I hold this and just use the arrow keys, you can hear there's sort of like a rhythmic movement to it now. And again, with the coarse tool, I can start moving that up and down. This sort of works in, what you call it, octaves, but not technically. So 0.5 is the same octave as the one below. 1 is double that octave. 2 is double that first octave. And then the next one will be 4 to double 2. So it sort of works in a ratio rather than straight octaves. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 octaves. And you can hear that as I move up and down the notes. If I play F3 for example, you can hear the movements a lot faster instead of F2, which it's slower, and then F1. Now what I'm going to do is, we could actually keep that, and if we actually drive, if we go here, and this is something I've just started recently using, which is basically like the saturator. It's basically a shaper that's got soft, hard and sine, and if you look at the saturator's waveforms, it's got the similar thing. And I can drive this using soft or any of the different types of shapes. And we've got dry and wet mix, so it can either be 100% on or 100, all the way down to 0%. I'm going to keep it 100% full and then really start to dry this, and we'll hear a lot of new harmonics being added as it starts to distort more. And it actually brings out that wobble a little bit better as well. Now what I am going to do is, I'm going to change this waveform. And you don't have to do this, we could keep it as these two sine waves FMing and start really adding saturators and other things to bring up those distortions, those extra harmonics. But for this I'm going to use square D, and let's listen to what that sounds like now. As you can hear, it's really started to bring those extra harmonics, and you can really hear that wobble happening now. So I'm also going to change this to a saw 3. As I was experimenting through, I found this actually sounded the best for what I was trying to achieve. Now you don't have to do this, obviously there's a lot of different waveforms here. What would be recommended is when you go to use and you start drawing your own in, try and keep it, as few harmonics as possible, because if you start to create a really complex waveform, you won't really hear that Reese sound anymore. It'll sound too cluttered, like there's too much going on. As you can hear, the octave above, so F1 and F2, what happens is the wobble is twice as fast, which is a really cool thing. We're straight away into Reese territory. Now the next thing is if I click in this time section down here, I'm going to change this to one voice, because I don't want it's a bass sound, it needs to be monophonic, and if we had it with anything above one, it means we can start playing chords, and this is not what I want when it comes to making this type of sound. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to PRD, just to add in a little bit more filter drive, just to give it a bit more distortion and extra harmonics on the top end. Cool, and that is pretty much the operator side of it done, because we're now going to freeze this track down, resample it and add it to a sampler. But before we do that, at the moment there is a lot of top end. And just use this EQ8 just to take out a little bit of the highs, especially above 10k, because if you think about it, your hi-hats, your lead lines, your vocals, anything that's got a lot of top end frequencies is sitting in that region. Now if your bass is as well, you're going to lose a lot of headroom in the top end of your mix. Same as if you had too much going down in your bass, like for example, that's why we roll off anything in the bottom end when it comes to snares, because that's where the kicks sit and the basses sit. So it's not too much, just a little bit of a rise around the 1 kHz region, just to bring in those extra harmonics, and a little bit of a dip towards the top with a low pass filter above 10k, just to get rid of those spurious top end, and then a glue compressor at the end just to stop it from clipping. Now if this had automation in it, obviously I'd resample this, but because it doesn't, I can just freeze the track, and holding Option down on a Mac or Alt down on Windows, you just drag that down there, and now we have the audio version of that MIDI operator thing that we created. And if we listen back to it, if I unfreeze this, for example, listen back, and then play that one, it's the exact same thing. That's just the audio version of that MIDI. Now the next thing we're going to do, just start turning these off. This is what I was experimenting with earlier, and then I'm just going to bring in a new sampler on that. Again, this is something that I was working on earlier, and then with that sampler there, I'm just going to drag this waveform straight into there. Now if I play it back now at F1 as I did before, if I turn on the record arm for it, there we go. Yep. Now there's an issue because the root note is C3, but I'm playing at F1, so I have to make those two notes exactly the same. Now one thing, just to go back, because I'm actually going to do this now, is at the moment, with this starting at 0 cents, there's 100 cents in a semitone. I've now actually made it 8 cents sharp from the fundamental, because we can't go below 0 cents with the operator. Other FM synths you can. What we can do to compensate for that is if I drop this down -4 cents, that basically means when it sort of resolves back with the wobble to its sort of fundamental note, it will always hit back to that F1 instead of being 8 cents sharper than it's supposed to be. Now another thing you might notice is, one, it's obviously quiet because I've put this in a group at -10 decibels, and another thing, it sounds a little bit duller. That's because initially when you load up a sampler, the filter's always turned on. So if we turn that off, we can listen to it again. Now for this, I am actually going to turn this on because I'm going to reintroduce some of those upper harmonics with saturate and glue compressor afterwards. Also, if I go to the pitch oscillator, I'm going to turn the glide on. So if I hold a note down, and another thing as well is if I go to, where is it? I always forget where this is. Always remember, in the filter global, because this is a monophonic sound, turn that back to 1. We don't want more than one note to be able to be played at once. And if I go back to the pitch oscillator tab, so now it's going to glide over 50 milliseconds from one note to the next. can make that glide longer or shorter as I wish. So for this, yeah, that sounds about right. Now the reason why it's stopping is I haven't actually set up the loop mode yet to do it for it to start properly reasing. It's like if we're in beats mode and we just have it stop as soon as the sample ends, basically. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the loop on so it's always constantly going forward, so when it gets to the end here, if I hold down a note, you'll see this line move across and go straight back to the beginning. And then if I turn it to this one, it's going to go to the end but then reverse back through it. But I'm just going to keep it as that for now because I want it to constantly sort of loop through as like a DJ would, and to turn on a beat repeat, it loops back from the beginning rather than going backwards on itself. And this is getting into the territories of the old sampling days, like with the SKETI S2000 and other samplers. This is that sound that drum and bass producers love, the old school sounding kind of basses where the algorithm, when you double the pitch, it's actually speeding up the audio twice as much. Because if we go back to this MIDI, the operator synth itself is making those extra notes as you go up the scale or down the scale, whereas this is speeding up or slowing down audio depending on where it's set from the root note. So there's little slightly different artifacts get added, which gives you that sort of old school sounding bass. I'm just going to grab hold of the end of the loop, and this is where it's good to actually turn on. I'm just going to move this out of the way actually and copy this down, and this is just going to play back over a bar with the click on, because what I want to do is when I press the fundamental I want it to be in time with the click. So if I start changing this loop, another thing as well is if we introduce the crossfade as now, turn that off, just gets rid of the clicks. Because one thing we could do is we could turn the snap on, so when it gets to the zero crossing point it always snaps to those points, so you'll never have any clicks. But with this having so many extra harmonics and overtones above the fundamental, we can't really hear those clicks that happen. But just to make sure that they don't happen, we can introduce crossfade. Now I'm just going to play this bar back over with a click involved and play a note, well actually in this MIDI region, and get it exactly in time with the click. And just hold that by itself. It's actually quite close to start with. It's too slow. Yeah, so we're in pretty much the right region we need it to be. Now this is two-taste, you could actually speed this up, but you could have it twice as fast if you wanted to. But it means now when I go to F2, is the right tone and speed movement of that wobble that I want it to be, especially with me writing an F. Obviously if you're writing in a different key, it's going to be slow or faster depending on which key you're writing in. Now the next thing, just to start bringing this level back up, is I've added a saturator with a dry wet mix of 37.3. So if you've watched my 808 bass tutorials or snares or kicks, you'll have seen this before, and this is just to sort of saturate it out more, add some extra harmonics in. I'm using the soft sine curve type, and I've driven that by 23.4 decibels. Again, this is to taste, because obviously if we went back to this and we use some different wave types, we're going to have a different type of saturation. And then after that, a glue compressor, just to really drive it with that makeup gain, to add some extra harmonics in, squeeze as much of the sound out of this as we can. It's going to start getting a lot louder now. Now this EQ8, because if you've noticed, this is actually grouped into an instrument rack. Now what I could do is to separate the sub and the extra harmonics of the bass out so the sub is solid, because if we think about this, this has got a lot of sub frequencies in it, this Reese that we've made, but they're also wobbling with that sort of frequency modulation that's happening, which can make your sub sound a little bit, doesn't fit cleanly within the mix, it's a little bit too dirty. So what you can actually do is group together with a sine wave sub, that if we just listen to this by itself, well, what I've actually done there is add a little bit of glue compression in as well, and a little bit of filter drive there, just to make sure that the sub is constantly at the same pitch. But the only issue that happens, because we've got the speed of this frequency modulating, with the two of them together, slight weird phasing things can happen. So this is entirely dependent if you want it in or you don't want it in, entirely dependent on the sound that you were trying to achieve. Because if I obviously roll off all of the bottom end on this, actually, you know what, I think I might keep that for now. It sounds cool. I've done a real big boost between 100 and 200 hertz because there was a lot of tonalities in this that I wanted. Because from making them earlier, this is similar to what I made. This area was quite cool for what I wanted it to sound like. Done a sweep in the mids, sort of similar to how I do with the drums and the kicks. Just as you can hear, that tone was it didn't sound too nice for this bass. Done another dip at around 3 kHz, just so if I had some drums like the clap of the snare, it sits nice at that. I could actually increase this if I wanted to, depends on what sound you're obviously wanting. But for this I did want it. And again, another roll off at the top end, just to make sure we're getting, not having too many spurious frequencies where the hi-hats, the leads, the vocals will sit. And then just to finish this off so it doesn't clip, well actually I'm doing a lot of driving on this one, so let's hear what it sounds like, a glue compressor. And as you can hear, the more and more we're doing this, it's really accentuating that wobble that's happening. And then another glue compressor, because obviously with that being in a group, just when it gets to the EQ, it's not absolutely slamming straight into the EQ. And then the last thing, an EQ8 outside of the group, just with another little bit of a bass boost, a dip here, between 1 and 2 kHz, a little bit of a peak, and then again, just really taking care of that top end with a low pass filter at about 10 kHz. Actually, I'm going to try a ×4 polarity on that one. And then this is something I'll just try on the fly. Yeah, holding Option down so I can change the Q. Yeah, that's better. So we've still got a lot of top end in there. It just means when we play some drums back with it, that sits nice in the mix. And then a glue compressor on the end just to make sure it's all clean and glued together and tidy so it doesn't clip. Now all I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this in so we can hear what it sounds like with a proper bass line. Now one thing that I did with this is, if we just go back to the Reese, is actually at the moment, yeah, it's completely in mono because when we recorded this we didn't add any stereo widths with it. Now this stereo width spread I'm not a massive fan of, because it can actually add in some extra phasing that I don't want. One that I would recommend as a stereo imager that sort of takes a mono and turns it into stereo is one by Voxenjo called Stereo Touch. And this is a really cool tool because it's free. And everything's good when it's free. It takes a while to get this thing sounding right, but once you do, it just really makes a nice stereo image. So I'm just going to turn that off for now. I'm just going to operate with this because, excuse the pun, operate. Because I'm just using Ableton Live tools for now, so anyone who only has Ableton Live can actually make some sounds just with Ableton Live. Fantastic. And what I've done as well is, if I go to, where is it? I always forget. I'm going to turn this to 2 semitones because in the MIDI region itself, if we look at the MIDI control, you can see that I've done some pitch bend curves. If we listen back to this by itself, as you can see, just adds a little bit more extra to, instead of it just being a single note with no pitch change whatsoever, just adds a little bit more interest, and this is the kind of thing that you do hear in this kind of music anyway. So I made a different kind of bass sound. This was just to fill the bass line out. Fantastic, and if we had some drums in as well. Cool. So if we just quickly listen to what we started with the operator, so this is what we started with, the simple sound that we used to resample and start creating an extra Reese out of it. And then this is what that has now become. Fantastic. And also what I did earlier as well is I was really experimenting around with lots of different types of Reese sounds. So as you can see here, there are 3 different waveforms that I use. If I just play these back, And the sort of possibilities are limitless, really, because if we think about back to this, it's all about how much coarse you've used, how much you've detuned it with the fine tuning sense, and also the mix between these two oscillators as well, when the frequency modulation happens from B into A. So yeah, the possibilities are quite limitless, really. If we listen back to this, making sure everything's turned off. Here's another one. Now this last one is actually done with a serum, but I'll do a different tutorial for that, but this is what it sounds like anyway. Now I know that does actually sound quite a lot different to the operator, but they're still within the same ballpark of sounding pretty decent. So you'd like to say you don't need serum to make decent sound, you can use operator if you want to FM. Obviously serum is my favourite synth, and I do love playing around with it, but just to show that you can actually do it with different tools instead of the big third-party synths that we often hear producers using. So yeah, anyway guys, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. If you'd like me to let's try that again, shall we? I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Any ideas that you've got for things that you want me to cover, please leave a comment below, like and subscribe, which always helps these videos get seen by more people. If you really like what I'm doing and want to support me in trying to do this more in the future as well, I've got a PayPal link below where you can donate some money as well. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Hi guys, SKETI here. Do you want to learn how to... Or how about... Or maybe even... Well, I'm now giving online one-to-one tuition. The lessons will be entirely centered around what you want to learn. We can cover such things as making drums, bass,
sound design, sidechaining, mixing, composition, music theory, mastering,
and much, much more. Maybe you just want to brush up on your production skills using Ableton Live or Logic, or whatever it is you want to learn. Get in touch on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube to find out more information. Bonus round. Every new student will get a free sample pack of their choice from my Exit Sounds sample label. So if this sounds good to you, and you want your tunes to sound less like and more like, and get in touch to find out prices and book your first lesson now. See you soon.
Everybody jump up, come on! Come on! Everybody jump up!